Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. Sorry about the late delay, the delay. I am Abe with Mystic Gen Mara, a small town mystic from the middle of Idaho. And tonight we are continuing our Occult and Crochet discussion on Gerald Gardner. I don't really have anything worth looking at in the crochet world, but I do have something else to check out. I have kimchi. I just got this started last night. It's only 24 hours old. It's got another at least 3 days before I can call it officially fermented. But that is what I have been working on this last week. So, but apologize for the delays. Some things were not going as well as I would like them to. And just as random as Idaho is, last night, we had over 4.5 inches of snow, give or take, and it is currently dropping hail about the size of peas all over the place. So it's a very interesting background I'm hearing right now. But we are going to dive back into the world of Wicca as we go further into Gerald Gardner. So when we left our hero, or maybe I should say adventurer, he was amassing a small fortune overseas from his homeland in Great Britain. He was living in the Orient at the time. So, in the year of 1920, Gerald's mother had passed away. And for unknown reasons, I couldn't find an exact reason. Doesn't mean there wasn't one out there, I just couldn't find it. He didn't return to Britain for the funeral, which I found a little bit weird. But he did return to Britain later when his father became ill in 1927. And his father had a form of deteriorating dementia, so he would eventually just forget who everybody was. And this would become a key turning point in the spiritual life of Gerald Gardner. While in Britain visiting his father, he would take a very serious look and start to investigate spiritualism, channeling, mediumship, things along that line. So this was the time when he went from just watching and studying the practices to how does this work? It's not just out there anymore. He wanted to bring it in here. This investigation led Gerald to having some occurrences that would leave him with the belief in the deceased family members that the people had passed over were trying to contact him. Some sources said that it was possibly his mother was one of the primary ones as well. So there were some things coming in that made him get a little bit more open to the suggestions. Now, this does not mean, and I have to give him credit for this, Gerald was not a pushover just because he was going to these things. He attended seances and spiritualist-themed churches, which is how you find out who's real and who isn't, and he was very skeptical of most of the mediums. I kind of have to agree on some points. If you watch enough of these people, especially the ones on TV and stuff, you start to question if they're just cold reading, because that's not that difficult. And he did consider many of the mediums frauds. But he did find a few that he deemed the real deal. Not many, but there were a few. What did I just write there? And this is where we start getting into him wanting to actually have experiences, not just study as an academic research project. But this journey into the channeling world would lead Gerald to something a little bit more valuable in some people's eyes. I think this is part of the reason he went as far as he did. And that was, he found his wife. And it was on the evening of July 1927. He would meet a woman by the name of Dorothea Frances Rosedale. And for some reason, she went by the nickname Donna. There's a lot of ways you could take Dorothea to make a different name, but She went by Donna. Can't quite figure that one out, but we'll go with that. In one of the sources, it was said that she was related to Gerald's sister-in-law. So one of his siblings was married to this woman's sister. So keeping it close to the family, not in the family, but close. One evening together, and he decided that this was the person he was going to pick. And the very next day, literally the next day, he proposed marriage to her. Thinking about how things go today, this was a completely different time, and I was, even for this time, a little bit shocked by how quick things went here. But one night, being at this medium seance thing, hanging out for a little while afterwards, the next day, he proposes. And what do you think she would say? I mean, what would you say? I met you last night, today you're proposing. She would say yes, and that kind of floored me a little bit. I expected a little bit of chasing. Nope, she just, oh yeah, sure, we'll do this. Yeah, like I said, a little bit of a shock there. But Gerald was only on leave to Britain during this time to visit his sick father. And before the end of August, when he had to leave, the couple would be married. They would celebrate their honeymoon on the island of Wight, Wight, and I'm not sure if I'm saying that completely right, so just that's how I heard it. And then they went off to the British Malaya again, off in the east. The new couple would settle in the area of Johor Bahru. I can't tell you, I listened to that name and I still can't say it right. And Gerald would become involved in Freemason practices again. And I am going to go over the Freemasons and the Rosicrucians and a few of these other groups, but I need to have some time to build that. Those are very intensive studies. Even one person involved in some of the foundational practices of either of them would take at least 2 hours, if not more, of just going. So that is a future thing. And the lodge that, Gerald would join would be the Johore Royal Lodge number 3946, but this was short-lived because he joined in like 1928. He was out again by 1931. The Masons never caught and held his attention, which I found interesting considering he liked secret stuff. This one did not resonate with him, so again, considering how many other groups were founded out of the Freemasons at some point, that's a little surprising. But Gerald would take up other interests with the practices of the locals again. Sorry, struggling tonight. And this time he readily accepted the beliefs and practices of magic because he'd had those mediumship experiences and he started making those connections. This time when he went and started studying, he was really more paying attention to the magical practice, not just from an analytical perspective. And for the rest of his time in the Malaya, he would become obsessed with the practices of magic within the local communities. And he was really fascinated by the weapons that they would use in rituals as well as war. But the ritual magic weapons were the ones that kind of fascinated him. And that would lead us to probably where we got a lot of our ritual tools today if you start looking into some of his history and how it's influenced things forward. Part of Gerald's interests would lead him to some archaeological pursuits as well. That's cool. And this would be a very secret endeavor because a local sultan was not impressed with what the sultan, would deem grave robbers. So to do excavations on archaeological sites was something you had to be very careful about. But even with that secrecy, even with that carefulness, Gerald would reveal miles of earthworks. I believe it was 4+ miles of earthworks amongst other finds, but that's a significant chunk of land. He also found tombs. He found porcelain from the Ming Dynasty. which I could not imagine finding some of that stuff, just, doing that kind of research. And he found many other items, but the tombs was kind of cool, but the Ming Dynasty porcelain, yeah, that's impressive. And this would eventually lead to excavations in Kota Tinggi and the Royal Cemetery. These are things that he was known for in his day, for being kind of the one to reveal a lot of this. Gerald's finds would be displayed in the National Museum of Singapore. That's what they call it today. So these things were huge back in his day, and for him to have to do it as secret as he was is kind of cool. He did find something that I thought was pretty interesting, though, and his digging around, he found beadwork and beads. Nothing special there, but these particular beads suggested a trade route from the Roman Empire back in the day, coming to Malaya, around Singapore area, through India. He was able to track a specific style from back in the day in Rome, and it's kind of the general path. So he actually was able to confirm that there was possibly trade between these two cultures at one point, which was, like I said, significant considering how long ago that was and how they weren't sure who was connected to who. Some of his research actually helped develop some of our modern theories. So that was kind of cool. Gerald would eventually come to think of himself as more of a folklorist, not so much as a civil servant, even though that was the job he was paid for. He was also thought of as an anthropologist to some extent, and he also would call himself kind of an amateur archaeologist. Considering some of the things he found that I was poking around with, amateur's not quite the right word, but he did find some interesting stuff. He just wasn't professionally trained, but a professional's got to start somewhere. So Gerald's historical interests would eventually lead him to being elected a fellowship with the Royal Anthropological Institute in 1936. So this is kind of a classy thing. His work was making waves in his day. And this has nothing to do with the occult, weirdly enough. It influences down the road, but we're not there yet. Through Gerald's travels up to this point, he ended up having some very interesting experiences, one of which was a lecture series on the Mother Goddess in 1932. This one caught his attention. It led to further excavations near Hambury Hill because after the lecture series, he kind of got to know some of the people involved with it, and they invited him to this other excavation. Which, again, probably wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for the fact that he made it to this particular lecture series. And it's interesting because as much as I've found about some of his experiences, trying to piece together everything was a little bit more difficult, and I will say right now, I'm going to do another stream video, whatever you want, however it turns out, on Gardenian witchcraft specifically. Right now, I kind of want to just focus on the man, because his experiences make a lot of the things within his practices and his coven make more sense. So we're going to just kind of finish going through him, and then I'll do a follow-up later on more of the magic and rituals within it. Gerald returned to the Orient after his Hambury Hill expedition and traveled around the area visiting various countries, and it was interesting because they talk about the Philippines, they talk about Thailand, they talk about what we would call Korea, they talk a little bit about Vietnam. Nothing specifically named, just kind of like key towns. The one exception, and this was interesting, was, and it said this explicitly, there was never a stop in China, the southern part at least, because there was a civil war and the train conductor refused to stop in any part of the country where the lines went. You boarded in one country, the train would take you to the next country. You did not stop in China at all. And that actually upset a lot of the passengers, including Gerald. But what are you gonna do? Risk everyone's life just because you wanted to wander around? And the conductor was like, no, we're not doing that. So onward. So there was some interesting travels there. Throughout his travels in that area, though, Gerald deepened his obsession with the crysknife. And if you have forgotten what that looks like, it will be this guy here. And he eventually would write a book about it. I didn't find a link directly to the book, so I didn't even mention the name here. But he had acquired over 400, give or take, examples of this particular blade style. In the description below, I did link a couple of different styles of modern day ones. They're not weapons grade, they're more for display, for fun, for ritual work. But you can still track down more information on the crysknives and how to find an actual one, although the original makers are becoming fewer and fewer because it is a lost art, where everything today in the West is like, how fast can we get it done? The actual makers of the knives are fading out of the Eastern communities, so finding a genuine one is going to be a little difficult, but there are some, like I said, examples in the description. In 1935, Gerald's father finally passed over and left him with a significant inheritance, really, of around 3,000 pounds. Now today we're talking several hundred thousand if we were doing inflation correctly. This allowed Gerald at this time to actually retire. Finally, type of a thing. He did want to stay in the Malaya over in the east, but Donna, his wife, did not. Therefore, they returned to England, which I think is actually the best option here, because of what developed out of that. On the return trip, Donna would actually go straight back to Europe, to England. She never deviated, just straight shot. And once she arrived, she started to set up a home. Gerald, on the other hand, because, well, why wouldn't he? He took his time getting around and exploring different places, and he became fascinated with one of the statues of Ashtaroth, which was a ancient deity, and he found some of the early statues of the Christian god, not what we would see today with, you know, the medium brown hair, shoulder length. There were older images, and he became very fascinated with them. And it was kind of something that he incorporated into his coven eventually. He would travel all over the Middle East, Lebanon, Greece, Turkey. Like, Greece isn't so much Middle East, but those were the areas that he was bouncing around. And he would eventually be invited to talk about his research with the crysknife along his journey. And here's where things start to get a little bit more interesting. I mean, his life wasn't boring to start with, but once Gerald finally ended up in Britain, almost 6 months to a year later, time frames were a little wonky there, he again became sick with his long-term illness, asthma, as well as other complications from it. And this led him to a doctor that told him to try a very unorthodox method of dealing with his asthma. The method? Nudity. It seemed to work for him, and he would eventually visit an indoor nudist group, and in the summer he started attending outdoor events, and it was all with this concept of being one with nature meant no clothes involved. I really, as I kept reading through that, I was like, because Gerald's the coven that came out of his work, Gardnerian witchcraft, a lot of it has to do with being sky-clad, sunbathing, meaning no clothes. Didn't quite understand where that all came from until I ran across this, and then I kind of dove into it. We won't get into a lot of details, but this one set of doctors, led by this one particular doctor, said that our clothing blocking us from sunlight was causing a significant portion of illnesses, from headaches, migraines, depression, and so take off all the clothes and you'll feel better. Okay. Not quite sure if I buy all of that, but at the time it did. And what's interesting is it worked for him, or at least it seemed to, because he started having less and less issues with his asthma. You can figure that one out, because I can't. Gerald would eventually purchase a doctorate of philosophy from a place that was linked to a school in Nevada. You send in money, we send you a piece of paper, says your doctor. And at times he would call himself Dr. Gardner, but it was mainly for show, just kind of trying to give himself credit for all the work that he had done. He did the work, but he wanted to have the PhD behind it. And unfortunately, no real groups, scholarly groups, would acknowledge this doctorate, and he would use it once in a while, but it kind of faded off eventually. And it was just after he collected his doctorate that he would write his first, we'll call it basically pagan, but it was a little bit more than that, book. And this is a hard to find in the physical copy book. I've linked in the description the Kindle version, and it was called A Goddess Arrives. And from what I could find of the description, I have not personally even heard of this book. I knew he wrote a bunch of other ones. This one was new. And it sounds like basically they're on a journey to discover the roots of the occult, and this is where he would end up landing, was a goddess coming in. So, like I said, there were some of these that were a little more difficult to find, and so if it was super difficult or I just couldn't find it, I didn't link it. But this one I at least found a Kindle version. So, Gerald would soon discover Rosicrucianism just after he wrote this first book, but due to the less than savory actions of the leader and some very poor predictions, he was less than impressed. Some of the predictions, this particular leader would say, there will never be a single invasion on British soil ever. Literally the next day after he published this, they were invaded. He claimed to be an immortal that had passed through time and physically had met Jesus, and on and on and on. And a lot of his followers, like most cult leaders, had just ate it up. They were like, oh, great man. Gardner was like, what? No, this doesn't make sense. So he kind of was pulling away, but while he was involved in this particular little group, he would keep researching other options. If something came up, he would look into it. He was kind of bouncing all over the place, but that's how most of us start. There were a couple of other things that were going on, political, social things that that Gerald was involved in, but they were more social, political. It had less to do with his travels, had less to do with his spiritual development, so we're skipping those. While he was in the Rosicrucian group, Gerald developed some friendships with others who were like him, who were more browbeaten, more logical thinking, more shoved off to the side within that particular order. And this group in particular was more interested in the occult. They didn't want to follow some yuppie guru who thought he was everything. And these particular group, according to Gardner, were not silver spoon people. They weren't trust funders, basically. They had to work every day, and when they weren't working, this is where they spent their time. That intrigued him, and so he wanted to get to know them better, because even at this point for Gerald, he had money and didn't have to work, so he could study things at leisure. But the people who were dedicated and were cutting time out of their lives specifically for this, he knew they were onto something, so he continued to work with them. This small group would eventually lead Gerald to officially being initiated as a witch and being called the name Wiccan, which is male witch, or good grief, I had this written down and I'm still messing it up. It's either Wiccy or Wixie for the female. I listened to it, my brain doesn't want to work today, so but this group would come to be known as the New Forest Coven. There is a little bit of controversy whether this was ever real or not, but he did develop the name Wiccan out of this culture, so something came out of it. Gerald claimed that this was one of the hidden surviving ancient pre-Christian groups, and there were only a handful of them according to him. Although people today claim that this coven was probably started in the 1930s by Gardner and his buddies. So really the roots of it at this point don't really matter because it's grown into such a massive thing, but this is the origin story that he proposed for his group. And there were a lot of things that were going on during this time, one of which, because of what was going on with a certain World War II bad guy wanting to come to Britain, Gerald really had talked about a lot, especially at this time period, a specific ritual where his coven would get together and they would raise a cone of power. So they would get in a circle and they would focus their energy and they would raise this energy field. And they would infuse this with a powerful command to stay away. And then they would send this to bad guy from WWII. Not sure how this exactly worked out because I couldn't find an exact date for when this happened as to when other things occurred, but it did appear to push back a little bit. So because bad guy never officially stepped foot in Britain that I know of, correct me if I'm wrong, World War II buffs, because I like a lot of it, but I haven't studied enough to be fully educated in it. So, Gerald would continue to visit his nudist groups, interestingly enough, and this would lead him to bringing others into older religions. So him being involved in this group, them talking to him and communicating, he would start spreading the knowledge that he had acquired. And that included one of the ancient groups called the Druidry. He would eventually purchase land with an established nudist colony. They were leasing the land. And Gerald eventually would get majority control of this colony. And what was his first order of business? Let's get new people in here. So he kept recruiting. Pretty much as long as he was alive, he was recruiting people to some form of group. Gerald would, during this time period of recruiting and building his nudist colony, acquire an old house that he called a witch cottage. One of his friends exchanged property for the house, so Gerald dismantled the house and moved it to this property and rebuilt it. He would then claim to have consecrated said cottage using ceremonial rituals that were found similar to ones in ancient grimoires, which are ceremonial magical books. Even though he practiced witchcraft and Wicca, he definitely leaned heavily on the ancient ceremonial magicians. Shortly after this, not quite to the level that Alex Sanders did, because comparing the two lines, Alex has a lot more ritual significance and a lot more focus on that. Gerald is a bit more free-flowing. There's still ritual and structure, don't get me wrong, but it's not quite as stiff of structure from what I've seen. But shortly after acquiring this house, Gerald would be ordained by the ancient British Church in 1946. It's kind of a non-denominational church is what we call it today. Very monotheistic, only one God, but it kind of non-denominational. Didn't have a big group as far as like this is the doctrine line that I could find. But he did join the ancient Druid order, and he would start attending rituals at Stonehenge after joining the ancient Druid order. And all I have to say is I am super jealous. Like, seriously jealous. I want to go to Stonehenge and do midsummer rituals. That's not fair. Anyway, this is also the year that he joined, in 1946, the Society for Psychical Research. Never let go of the paranormal, had to know more, and the Society for Psychic Research was big in disproving people who were frauds, but also helping to understand and deepen the study. Today, there's still people who call them hacks, but there's a lot of things that are called hackery that might actually be more true than not. So take it with a grain of salt. On the May Day of 1947, Gerald would be introduced to one of the most notorious ceremonial magicians of all time, Aleister Crowley. This would lead Gerald to being introduced to the Ordo Templi Orientis, OTO, and over time, Aleister would elevate Gerald to the level of 4th degree in the order before the ancient magician's death, which was kind of sad because I'm pretty sure Crowley would have elevated him further, but you have to be trained, and that was Crowley's big thing. Don't do stuff without knowledge. So, where did I just lost my place? After this, Gerald and Donna would travel to the United States after his his elevation, and here he would hope to learn voodoo. Yeah, because why not? I just learned everything else. Let's try out this too. But during this journey from Britain to the States, Crowley would pass away, and at this point Gerald would try to take the leadership of the OTO, didn't go so well, and he would eventually walk away from the OTO and let other people deal with it, and he would return to his witchcraft roots. Gerald would try to express, and I guess you could call it expose, some of the teachings of Wicca in a quote-unquote fictional work called High Magic's Aid. I borrowed this from a friend years ago, and I only read parts, got halfway through it because I needed it back, and so I didn't finish it, but he did reveal a few things in there that let's just say you wouldn't expect from a truly fictional work. He would include scenes that would harken back to ancient grimoire ceremonies, which do show up in there, and he did have a couple of other hints and subtleties added in, alluding to Wicca rituals. What's interesting is one of his followers down the line a little ways, not sure how far down the line, but one of his people who were initiated through his line is Raymond Buckland, and he would write several nonfiction works on the occult, on witchcraft specifically, on spirits, on symbols, but he wrote some fiction books as well, and his fiction books are fascinating because you read through them thinking, oh, this is just a book on fill in the blank, because he did some ceremonial magic but also some witchcraft ones. And as you're reading through it, especially if you've read some of the other stuff that he's done, Gerald Gardner, Sanders, etc., you start to see he actually was putting almost full rituals. There's pieces he left out, but he was almost putting full rituals into his books so that you could start to understand. And personally, what I think that he was doing, Gerald and Raymond following him, was showing you that this isn't as woo-woo scary as you'd been led to believe. Because up until 600 AD or so, being a witch wasn't that big of a deal. It was just kind of what you were. There was only certain groups that didn't like you, but you could still avoid those groups and it wouldn't be a big deal. But there was a certain movement that was growing at that time, and they really did chase away and hunt down at one point the concepts of witches and healers and that kind of stuff. So he was trying to reintroduce in a more gentle way these beliefs and concepts, which, like I said, if you're going to do it, fictionalize them so that people get a little bit more comfortable with it. And that's what he was doing. And it was during this time of transition, this time of all these writings, this studying, this being elevated, that he would actually get his first initiates into his own coven. The first was in 1949, and the second was in 1950. And these two in particular would stay with Gerald pretty much for the rest of his life. They would be connected to him in some way. And this is where we officially can say the Gardnerian line would start. So 1949, 1950. Gerald would eventually move to the Isle of Man in 1951. And There, he took the tongue-in-cheek title of Resident Witch. Of course he would. And I love the sense of humor, because if I moved somewhere like that with his history, I would totally take that title just because it'd be funny. Anyway, he was working with another gentleman at the time, developing a museum of witchcraft and superstition. This partnership eventually would have a bit of a falling out. The gentleman would return to Britain, and Gerald would take over running the museum, and he would actually be the primary caretaker until his death. So this kind of became his, I wouldn't say employment, but a way to make some extra money. Gerald would keep moving south in the winter to keep his asthma at bay, and it was during one of these winter trips that he would meet in person, because he'd been writing communication with her, but it was Doreen Valiente, and she would be initiated into the Gardenian line at midsummer in 1953. And she has her own role, and we'll go over her later, but she plays an important aspect of his growing spiritual group. Over time, Doreen would help Gerald edit his Book of Shadows, which is a book of rituals, thoughts, essays, magic, etc. And for public, for some odd reason, I can't quite figure out why she did this, she helped him remove all influences from Aleister Crowley. Again, I'm not exactly sure why she had to take out all the influences and anything associated with Crowley, especially when they started sharing it with the group, because a lot of Crowley's teachings, with simple adjustments, could have been made to fit within the framework of what Gerald was doing without any issues, but she took him out anyway. So, at any rate, Gerald would eventually publish the non-fiction work, and this is just, he's still working on his Book of Shadows, but it was shortly after this that this particular little text would be published, Witchcraft Today. And it would include a preface from Margaret Murray, which is interesting considering Margaret had been having a very hard time during this book's publication. Due to some drama about her own writing, and I do plan on covering a lot of these people, that's why I'm mentioning them now, but Gerald supported her through all of the chaos that was going on with, everything that was going on with her. Gerald believed that there was more truth to what she had said than what the mainstream was giving her credit for. He also believed in the fairies to a form, not fully like you would see today in a lot of our work, but he did believe in them. And he also believed in the idea that the Knights Templar were all members of the ancient craft that he was a member of. Today, not that big of a deal. At that time, that was an exceptionally bold statement from him. So Margaret Murray's foreword. Formerly assistant professor in Egyptology at University College London, Margaret Murray had a very powerful position in her day. And I won't read I'll just kind of give you an idea. She said, personal worship takes many forms, but a group of persons worshiping together always devise some sort of ritual, especially when the worship takes the form of a dance. She was very big into that from what I can remember. It's been a while since I've read her work, so the prayer dance is usually for the increase of food, therefore imitates a stylized form of movement of animals or growing of plants for which the increase is desired. So she was saying you basically are mimicking or giving nature an example of what you want it to do. The stage is often set and regarded by the worshippers as a special divine favor, denoting actual advent of the deity into the body of the worshipper. There is a form, I won't call it full invocation, where you bring something in, but it was basically like you're taking on a form, and that was a big practice back in the day. Dr. Gardner, again, she liked to call him doctor, even though he wasn't, she actually was, has shown in this book how much of the so-called witchcraft is descended from ancient rituals and has nothing to do with simply spellcasting and evil practices. It's the sincerest expression of the feeling towards God, which is expressed perhaps more decorously, though not more sincerely, by modern Christianity and church services. I have to agree with her on this, because when you really look at the ancient practices, they were so much more in devotion than sitting in a pew listening to someone ramble on, and I'm sorry, I feel like that in most churches nowadays, or standing up, saying a prayer, sitting down, standing up, sitting down, however it works in your specific church. When you're involved in a group working, especially this type of nature-based one, everyone's involved, you all have an experience. There's something else I had tagged here. Just a second. Can't find it. Oh well. I have like a lot of little notes in here, so we'll skip that for now. But she was just kind of giving a lot of support to what he was doing, and he was supporting her by even letting her put her forward preface in here. So, by bringing Margaret Murray in, this was one of the first kind of controversial things that he had done. Writing some of his other works, they were fictional, so it wasn't that big of a deal. This work, being nonfiction, and having someone who was a little disgraced for her in her day do the preface, this was some big publicity and a little bit controversial at the time. But Gerald didn't care. He would go on to court publicity after this publication. He invited, and they all do this, and I can't quite figure out why, knowing what's going to happen afterwards. He invited the press, reporters, people from the public to go to the rituals, to not so much participate, but be an observer. My hair's stuck. And carry on with these talks as well. And they would go, and then would write the most slanderous, insulting publications about him. Some would claim he was a Satan worshiper. Others said that he was whitewashing the evil practice of witchcraft and magic, and how dare you bring this into our communities. Fine and dandy, but his groups kept growing. It wasn't like Alexander's where it exploded, but they kept growing. There was an anchor there. People were resonating with what Gerald was saying. The papers might be, being bombastic and ignorant, but people were actually experiencing it, and they were being drawn to what he was doing. Interestingly enough, no matter how bad the press got, this did not end Gerald's career or cut his powerful ties in the government. A little surprised by this one. He was even invited, brace yourself for this one, he was even invited to Buckingham Palace for a garden party specifically for him in recognition of his years of civil service to the crown in the East. This occurred in 1960, give or take. So even with all the bad press, I couldn't remember the time of the year, sorry, he was still very well liked, had an amazing reputation amongst the higher-ups. The academic elite didn't really like him, but I'm sure no one liked the academic elite either. So, this, though, was not the best year for Gerald. Shortly after this trip to Buckingham Palace and the accolades that went with it, Donna would pass from this world, and it is said that this tragedy would actually traumatize Gerald to the point where his asthma would kick back up in full force, bringing side effects with it. In 1961, Gerald, with the two primary followers, the ones from 1949 and 1950, would travel to the island of Majorca, and there they would meet up with the poet Robert Graves. Graves shows up, and I've read some of his work, so I can see how this fit in. But his work would help support this spiritual group. Primarily his poem, however you want to phrase that, with titled The White Goddess. These were big influences in the growing Gardnerian line. This journey, unfortunately though, would end up being his last. He left in 1961 to visit Robert Graves, and he traveled around through the area, including Lebanon and things like that. It was during this journey, in 1964, he was returning from wintering in Lebanon. He was going back to Britain. He would suffer a severe heart attack while at sea, and this would be his last day. He was 79 years old when he passed away, and he was just kind of buried in Potter's Field type thing. When they landed at the next port of entry, the only person at his funeral was the captain and a couple of the crew members. Can you imagine the things that this man had seen? When I was looking at the time frame, I'm fascinated by people who've lived through this, or from like 1890 through about 1980. Those windows of time, so much changed. The world literally took a snow globe, shook it up, and then it just swirled and reset. These were huge periods of drastic change. In almost 80 years, dying in 1964, look at the changes in the world that Gerald had seen. Some of which he actually had a little bit of influence on, like the spiritual communities. To me, this is the part of his life that's so fascinating, is when you look at the scope and the years of his life and what was going on in the world. World War I, World War II, the changes in Britain, the changes in the East, the changes in the Middle East. Even in this country, things were changing rapidly. The rise of the Iron Curtain, the fall of the Tsars in Russia. He saw all this happen in real time. Like, that's just so amazing. Even with all of that, he was able to develop a spiritual practice, maybe one from who knows how long ago, or it could have been one he just combined enough other projects into making his own. Either way, it stood the test of time and is still here today. You can still find groups associated with Gardnerian witchcraft. There are still covens out there tied to the original. Through a line you can trace, just very straight, back to it. Like I said, Raymond Buckland is one of them. He passed away a few years ago. And you can track his stuff directly back to Gerald Gardner. He expounded and expanded greatly on that work. And there's some other ones I'll talk about later. One is still alive, and she's quite a prolific writer, actually. But these are all people who've come from these groups. They're very ancient as far as the concept of their group. Maybe not all of it. You never know. But the concepts were fully ancient. But I won't leave Gerald just floating around out in the Middle East somewhere in a tomb. Gerald's body is now in a cemetery in Tunis. It was moved in recent years. In 2007, a plaque was attached to his grave as a memorial. The inscription on the plaque states, "The father of modern Wicca, beloved one of the goddess." Gerald Gardner, this was one of his wishing wells, was an amazing person, just as a person. His contributions to the world of archaeology were fascinating, and I didn't realize how much. I've read part of High Magic's Aid, and I've read this entire book at least twice. His contributions led to a revival of an ancient nature-based religion, without all the ceremonial claptrap that ceremonial magicians like to involve. There is some. He does have some things you have to use for his practices. He had some unique theories and thoughts on working with energy in a ritual, primarily his focus on nudity. But he did a lot in his life to influence and grow spirituality. He loved to fluff his hair, to stand it up, and at times you'd see some of his pictures on some of his books. He would actually pull his hair, part it and pull it up so he had like horns, and then he would take his beard and pull it down into this great big long string. Sometimes he would split it so he had like horns and then horns coming off his chin. He was an entertaining character, and he didn't mind shocking people. Sometimes people need to be shocked. He wasn't as in your face as, say, Aleister Crowley or people along that lines. He didn't court publicity to the extent that Alex Sanders would, who started the other primary line of Wicca today. But in his own way, he did. He did it on a more subtle way, and what he developed pushed through even to this day. So, as I said, I will talk more specifically about his line of witchcraft later. I may just talk about witchcraft in general. I haven't quite decided how I'm going to do this, because Gerald Gardner and Alex Sanders have so many things similar, because Sanders came out of Gardner's line. I haven't quite decided how I want to do that yet, but I will go over the kind of core principles, some of the base tenets of what it means to be in those groups, as well as tools of the trade. That's all public information. It's not like I'm going to be exposing secrets, but they kind of expose their own secrets. Gerald talks a lot about the tools in here, and in High Magician's Aid he talks about a lot of, or High Magic's Aid, he talks a lot about tools as well, even though that's more of a fictional account. Same thing with Alex. A lot of the information is out there if you choose to look for it. But I think, make sure I got all my information here. Does look like I did. Let me know your thoughts in the comments section down below. I know this wasn't deep into the magic, but this was a man who did develop a new line, and he tied in aspects of Egyptology, a lot of Eastern traditions, as well as a possible line that's been in active use since pre-Christian days. Again, that one, who knows? But he was a fascinating character, and definitely a character. Let me know in the comments below what you thought. If there's anyone else that you want to talk about, any of the people I've mentioned in here, I will be discussing Margaret Murray. I do want to talk about I just wrote down the other name. There's a few other names here I want to discuss from this. I might talk about Robert Graves, but he doesn't seem to me as being more focused on the spiritual. He's known for being a poet, so haven't decided on him yet. But we will discuss some of the other things later. And now I'm starting to ramble. So, if you enjoyed this video, please drop a like on it, hit that subscribe button if you're new here, and like I said, comment, let me know thoughts, opinions, ways to improve, and we will see you in the next video. Oh, by the way, I'm doing a challenge to myself. Every day this month I will be doing a live stream or uploading a video, and this is February of 2024, so keep your eyes peeled for other streams, other videos if you're interested. I do have another live stream planned for Tuesday the 6th. I was going to do a video. That's not going to work out. It's going to have to be longer than that, so we'll be doing a live stream on Tuesday 7:30-ish Mountain Standard Time, as long as my technology works, and I will see you guys later. Where's the button?